All right, y'all. So today I am going to talk about a place in history I have yet to talk about, and that is Japan. I'm super excited about this video. I've been wanting to talk about Japan for a while now, but I was a little worried, and I'm going to get into that with some context and disclaimers before I get into the meat and potatoes of this video. I'll try to keep it brief, okay? It was way more difficult to find reliable sources to create this video than I had anticipated. Like, I knew that it was going to be rough, but I didn't think it was going to be that rough. And the reason why is there's not a lot of reliable sources that are created by Westerners that provide the information in an unbiased way. Like, obviously I would prefer to be able to read and write Japanese, but I can't. And so I have to depend on sources that are in the English language, essentially. So it's very difficult to find sources that aren't unbiased. And I mean, that could also be said for sources that are purely in Japanese, I'm sure. But coming from an info sciences background, I try my best to be as careful as possible when I create these videos. With that being said, I'm human. Obviously, we make mistakes, but I really wanted to do this topic justice. And so what I did was I did a little bit of digging to see if I could find what is the source that was created by a Westerner on the subject. And so our topic today is specifically going over the Tokugawa period, aka the Edo period. So I came across this big guy, The Making of Modern Japan by Marius B. Jansen. This was the go-to book that I came across a lot during my research. That is a very reliable source that presents the information in an unbiased way. So the bulk of the information that I'm going to share in this video is from that book, with a few little bits of other sources sprinkled in there to kind of fill in some gaps that he doesn't cover. Now, if you're interested in reading this book yourself, I was able to buy it off of Amazon for like $20-something used, but be forewarned, this is a very academic-y read. Not something you read on the weekend as a leisure thing, maybe get some Harry Potter for that. But it is super great information. I probably wouldn't have made this video without that book. So with that being said, I tried my best to paint as accurate a picture as possible when talking about the Tokugawa period for this video. I hope you enjoy it. That's the end of my disclaimer / context section. And I did not mean for it to be this long. I apologize. So let's get into the video. Japan's Tokugawa period spans from roughly 1603 to 1867, and it was governed by the Tokugawa Shogunate. And this period is defined as the very beginning of Japan's early modern period. Now, this was a very peaceful time in Japanese history. However, it was also a very strict time for its citizens. This period was part of a very long time in Japanese history where the warrior class ruled. And what that means is that the emperors mostly ruled in name, more like a kind of figurehead situation, while the shoguns, they actually ruled. They had the real power in the relationship. Now, some of you may not be familiar with Japanese history at all, and I will go over some of these terms. I don't know about you, but in my Western education, we really didn't talk about Japanese history or a lot of other histories that weren't solely about the Western experience. But I never learned about shogunates and shoguns and daimyo and all these different groups. So rest assured, for those of you whose education system also failed them like me, I will go over what these terms mean as we go along. So shoguns were military generals who rose from the samurai class, and they were the de facto rulers of Japan at this time. The shogun was the figurehead of the shogunate, also known as the bakufu, which was the feudal government structure that the shogun resided within. The Tokugawa Shogunate was founded by a man named Tokugawa Ieyasu. Ieyasu was able to unify almost all of Japan under one central government. And this government or system was defined by feudalism. This was a very strict government that was all about its social class, its social hierarchies, which we'll get into in a moment. But Ieyasu was not the only person responsible for this unification of Japan. There were also two other great leaders before him that started the process. And these two guys were Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi. I found in my research that the only way that I could get a real understanding of what was going on in the Edo period was to understand what happened before that period began. I'm not gonna lie, I was so confused for a good chunk of my research. I'm like, oh, and this happened, and holy shit, why? What is that? What are those? Those were the questions that constantly went through my mind as I was reading this complicated book, okay? I'm gonna go over the details of what led up to the Edo period and why the Edo period came to be. So before the Edo period, it was a crazy time in Japan. This period in Japan is known as the Sengoku Period, also known as the Warring States Period. And I think the title alone can kind of give you a little bit of an idea of what was happening in Japan during this time. Warlords would battle back and forth for supremacy, and many daimyo and clans were vying for power, and they fought to seize control over the country. And this strife resulted in constant warfare, just constant chaos. Now, just to give you some clarification, because I promised, the daimyo was a feudal lord from the samurai class, and this role came about sometime around or before the 10th century. And these guys were landowners. They had administrative and military authority, and they ruled over domains, also known as han. So now that I've kind of laid the groundwork to give you an idea of the overarching situation in Japan, very simplified, I know, but we're short on time. We got a lot to cover in a very small amount of time. So enters this guy, Oda Nobunaga, into the scene, okay? Nobunaga was the leader of a clan called the Oda clan, and this was a very powerful clan. Nobunaga would go on a series of military campaigns to conquer rival daimyo and obtain their domains. Nobunaga, I don't honestly know a better way to put this. This guy was the shit. I'm sure he had many flaws like many people do, but his military prowess was pretty remarkable. I mean, this guy was the first military general in Japan to introduce guns into Japanese warfare. I can only begin to imagine the facial expressions on the men across the field as they're shooting at them, pow, pow. Can you imagine that shit? This is the first time you are seeing this, and you're like, all right, we're going off to fight this rival daimyo like any other day, you know, during the Warring States period. That's just life during this time. And then you arrive and pow pow. Holy shit, man. And this new technology, guns, was introduced to the Japanese by the Portuguese. And Nobunaga, he sure as shit took advantage of this new technology to accomplish his mission. He also formed strategic alliances with other powerful daimyo, including Ieyasu and Hideyoshi. And these two would fight side by side Nobunaga up until Nobunaga's death. Unfortunately, Nobunaga would die in 1582 before he was able to complete his dream of unifying all of Japan under one power. And this was because he was betrayed by one of his generals. He got his. Ieyasu and Hideyoshi would most definitely avenge their mans. So after the powerful Nobunaga dies, the person who succeeds him is none other than Hideyoshi. And this is just a quick sidebar. Hideyoshi, this man came up from the trenches. Very remarkable life story. He started as a peasant and then became one of Nobunaga's most trusted generals. And then after becoming one of Nobunaga's most trusted generals, he goes on to try to complete his mission of unifying all of Japan, starting off as a peasant. It's crazy. Unfortunately, you wouldn't be able to do that during the Edo period, but I'm getting ahead of myself. And also, that's not to say that Ieyasu didn't have a remarkable come up as well. There was a lot of drama between these three men over the course of time that I didn't cover. It wasn't as simple as, you know, it started with Nobunaga, then Hideyoshi, and yes, like there was a lot of inner workings with it that would require a whole separate video in itself. But just know that I definitely simplified this, but I'm gonna keep it pushing. Now, at this point, we're still within the Sengoku period, the period of the Warring States. We're not quite at the beginning of the Edo period yet. And while we're still here, I would like to include in this video some really cool shit that came out of this period. It wasn't all just war war and fighting. Some really cool things that came out of this period include the tea ceremony, or sado, becoming a more refined practice. There was also a lot of cool architecture, art, and literature that was born during this time. And in total, the Sengoku period lasted roughly from 1467, and it wouldn't completely end until the Edo period was established in 1603. On October 21st in 1600, a very pivotal battle would take place between daimyo, and this battle was called the Battle of Sekigahara, and this resulted in Ieyasu becoming the victor. This is considered one of the most notable battles in Japanese history because it was the defining marker of the beginning of Japan's early modern period. This marked the beginning of the Tokugawa Shogunate as well as the end of the Sengoku period. So now here we are officially in the Edo period. Ieyasu was named shogun by the emperor, and he and his shogunate set up shop in the city of Edo, which became the capital of Japan, and they got to work. Oh, and by the way, for those of you who might not know, Edo is modern day Tokyo, and I didn't know that. So if you didn't know that, it's okay. The Edo period ushered in 250 years of peace and stability for a time. And throughout that time, the shogunate would produce 15 shoguns, with, of course, Ieyasu being the first. So now that I've laid the foundation and we've arrived at the Edo period officially, there were so many aspects about the Edo period that I really wanted to talk about, but again, time. So I decided to focus on the social and policy aspects that define this period. The Edo period would introduce the Sakoku Policy, and it restricted foreign trade, prevented Japanese citizens from traveling abroad, and restricted the presence of foreigners. Up until recent years, a Western perspective of what was going on in Japan during this time has really been pushed. This idea that Japan had been completely isolated from the entire world by closing off its borders. This Western perspective of Sakoku defines the policy on the idea that Japanese world revolved around Europe because they weren't completely shut off from the world. They were involved in trade with China. They had imported Indian textiles. They also exported things like lacquer, ceramics, and soy sauce. They were also using Chinese sugar refining techniques. There were also European nations that visited Japan during the Edo period. There was the Spanish, the Dutch, and the Portuguese. Now, with that being said, these interactions were most definitely monitored by the shogunate, but claiming that Japan was completely shut off from the rest of the world at this time is a bit of an exaggeration. And their economy was also self-sufficient, which allowed them to be a bit more strict on who they dealt with, who they let in, who they interacted with, because this was a very prosperous time for Japan. Now, with that being said, I'm not trying to lighten the policy, how strict Japan's borders were at this time. I don't know, there's just something about saying that they were completely shut off from the rest of the world because we can't get in, us specifically, is kind of bogus. All right, so something else I wanted to talk about is the social aspect. If you Google Japan Edo period social hierarchy, something like that, you'll find one of these social hierarchy pyramids. Some variety of it, give or take a couple things in it. We've got the emperor at the top, then the shogun, the daimyo, the samurai. Some of them have ronin in them, peasants, artisans, and merchants. But Japan's social hierarchy during this time is way more complicated than what meets the eye in these pyramids. I wouldn't say that it's a reflection of India's caste system. It's a bit more nuanced than that. It's not as direct as that. For example, although the emperor sits at the top of the pyramid, he's not really the one with the power. He's not the one who has the military power, which is essentially the power. He also doesn't have the political power of none other than the shogun. That is the leader. That is the person who is really in charge. The emperor was more of a figurehead. That's not to say that the emperor wasn't important. This role was symbolic of prestige and legitimacy. It's just that the shogun was the one who had all the military power. This shogun was a big deal. This was a major military leader who was from the samurai class. What I found interesting was that the shogunate and the imperial court were in two totally different locations. The emperor remained in Kyoto, and the shogunate and the shogun, they were in Edo, which was the capital. And they did their own thing in their own little areas. And what I also found interesting was that the shogun was a hereditary title, very similar to the way that Western monarchies operate, where it's blood over capability, or popularity. All right, moving right along on the tier list. Next, we have the daimyo. Daimyo were samurais who were feudal lords, and they would rule over domains, or han, as I mentioned earlier. And domains vastly varied in size and importance. You could have a giant domain with a lot of stuff going on, or you could have a little itty bitty bitty domain with not a lot of stuff going on. The daimyo during this time were put under much tighter constraints by the shogunate. They had complete rule over the daimyo, even though the daimyo ruled over their own domains. But what's interesting about that is that the majority of daimyo houses were assigned their domains by the shogunate. Their assignments could change or be terminated altogether. I can giveth, I can taketh. Now, samurai, just, non-daimyo, just regular samurai, could work for a daimyo. This was a very peaceful time in Japan, so those romanticized depictions of samurai that we commonly see doesn't really fit into the Edo period in reality. During this period, at least, samurai could become bureaucrats, administrators, hell, they could even be artisans if they wanted to. They could also be courtiers for daimyo, but this idea of being a warrior, because again, this is a peaceful time, was not really necessary. Instead of fighting, one could become a scholar. Peasants, also known as hayakusho, occupied the majority of the population at this time. Peasants were one of the most important class because they produced goods, specifically food. They were farmers, and they worked the land to not only feed themselves, but also to feed their daimyo. And peasants could make a shit ton of money. And when you think about the term peasant in a Western sense, you're thinking like, yes, me lord, I planted the radishes. Please, can you spare one turnip? Just a turnip. At least that's what I was thinking in my head when I think of peasant. But in Japan's Edo period, that's not a peasant. A peasant could have a shit ton of money. They could be a respected family in a community. They could own the land that they worked, and the daimyo would tax it. And if this peasant family was in good standing, they had a lot of wealth, they paid their taxes on time, they were held in high esteem. All right, so this is editing Laurier. So I realized while editing this video that I was coming across, it's a glamorizing peasant life in Tokugawa Japan, just a little bit. Okay, maybe a lot. And this is definitely not what I meant to do. So we're putting in a little edit here to paint a much better picture. So it's estimated that 90% of the population were peasants at the beginning of Edo society. And while there was a possibility for someone from the peasant class to become wealthy, the taxes that I mentioned were such a burden for so many peasant farmers, so much so that it made it difficult to feed their own families at times. And there was a rice tax levied on the villages and the village representatives, who were more often than not farmers themselves, and they dispersed this tax amongst all the villagers. And this is because rice was like gold in Edo Japan. It was the foundation of their economy and a main staple food source. In fact, domains were ranked by the shogunate by their rice harvesting output. And there was actually a Tokugawa law that forbade peasants from moving, making them tied to the land. But when there's a will, there's a way, because in actuality, there were some farmers who would move to a new land to avoid this high tax and to improve their quality of life, which personally, I don't blame them. And some farmers were taxed by a fixed amount system where the rice tax for the next 3 to 5 years was determined by their average output from previous years. And then some farmers were under an inspection system where an official inspector would visit to check in on the farmer's annual yield. Some officials could be bribed, and the official could underreport their crop output so that the villages paid less in taxes. While on the other hand, one could also have an official who was just a complete asshole and would increase the farmer's taxes for no good reason. So that's it from Editing Laurier. I hope I painted a much better picture of the peasant class. Back to your scheduled programming. Artisans were producers like peasants. However, they created goods that were seen as not really necessary for survival, is the best way that I can put it. They created goods like ceramics, textiles, and tools. So these were still very important things. They were respected for their skills and contributions to society. They also had guilds that they operated within, which regulated their standards and practices. Time for the final class on the pyramid, the merchants. I was so curious about it when I first saw this. I'm like, merchants at the bottom? What's the story behind that? Merchants were listed at the very end because they did not produce tangible goods. More so, they performed a service. And that service was selling shit that other people made, which is nothing wrong with that. That's a modern day business person. I want to be able to sell shit that other people make. The merchant class was involved in commerce, trade, as well as retail business. And these guys were oftentimes given the side eye because of the amount of wealth that some of these guys would amass. And so to kind of, keep them in check, they were, put right there at the bottom, right down there. And also because, again, they didn't make anything because, you can buy power, you can buy influence. And so we gotta, just keep them there. Artisans made things, peasants made things, but then you've got the daimyo, the samurai, the emperor, the shogun. They don't make shit, but it's a different story for them. They're special. Now, believe it or not, the borders of every group weren't finite. One could potentially move, through a group, usually downward. It could happen. Each group was very distinct, self-governed, and they had a degree of autonomy. But there were folks who lived outside of this hierarchy because they weren't even allowed to be a part of it or to even touch it. And that is a parallel to India's caste system. And this group made up a large percentage of the population in Japan during this time. One of those groups was known as the Eta, and they were associated with the idea of defilement and death. And this is because they typically worked in occupations like slaughtering and disposing of animal carcasses, tanning and creating leather goods, executions, and the disposal of corpses. Some Eta worked outside of these jobs exclusively reserved for Eta and were able to farm land, but typically they would farm this land on the outskirts of towns or cities. These people faced a lot of discrimination. They were essentially invisible to society. The Eta would live in clusters outside of towns and villages. And what's really like a gut punch to me is that they would be excluded from Tokugawa maps. Like their villages or their communities, they didn't even exist on a map, but the government did keep tabs on them to make sure that they weren't Christians. They did do that at least. And the reason why these people had to live on the outskirts of towns and cities is very similar to India's caste system with the untouchables class. If you were associated with the Eta or touched or what have you, then you would be considered defiled. Eta was also a class that was inherited through the family. So there was no way to escape this class. This is very sad. And you know what's really messed up? I'm like, somebody gotta get rid of the corpses, man. Somebody gotta cut up the meat. Somebody gotta make the leather. You should just leave the carcasses just piled up in the town. But at the same time, and this isn't to lighten the discrimination that this group faced, they were given a certain level of autonomy, just like the other groups that I mentioned that are actually part of the social hierarchy. They actually had a headman for the Eta who was recognized by Tokugawa authorities, and he was responsible for their comings and goings and to make sure they stayed in line and what have you. And this person was held accountable for his people. There was also another group like the Eta that was placed outside of the social hierarchy, and they were called hinin or non-human. And these were people who worked in professions like fortune telling, prostitution, or begging. While Hinin were also a marginalized group like the Edo, they weren't as restricted as they were. Hinin communities were not as clearly segregated like the Edo communities were. They could actually live embedded within main society. This also wasn't a hereditary status. But anyway, just like the Edo, they also faced quite a bit of discrimination. People believed in a variety of belief systems in Edo Japan, and some of these beliefs were a bit complex. They pull from a few different areas. But the official religions that were promoted by the Tokugawa Shogunate were Shintoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism. These belief systems made certain occupations impure, like, for example, working with dead animals or disposing of corpses. For the most part, Tokugawa authorities allowed people to worship a variety of beliefs, as long as those beliefs didn't threaten the shogunate's power. Christianity was not one of those beliefs. It was a threat to the shogunate. The first documented exposure Japan had to Christianity was in 1549, when Portuguese Catholic missionaries came to spread the good word. And because the shogunate saw Christianity as a threat to its power, the religion was banned, and people who were found out to be Christians were put to death. Like all things, everything has an end. And when the Tokugawa period fell, it marked the end of a 700-year warrior rule in Japan. Now, the Western interpretation of the end of the Edo period is just as self-absorbed as its description of Japan completely shutting its borders off from the entire world. For some time, Westerners had pinpointed the arrival of a man named U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry as the reason behind the end of the Edo period. Perry arrived with a fleet of warships in 1853, and his goal was to set up trade with Japan and open its borders to the Western world, among other things. A treaty was signed between the U.S. and Japan called the Treaty of Kanagawa, and this opened their ports to American ships. There's been a lot of debate as to whether or not this treaty was signed by Japan under duress. I'll leave that up to you to decide. I mean, they did arrive with a fleet of warships, so while this arrival of the US of course played a major role in the end of the Edo period, there was also a lot of other things going on internally in Japan. There was a lot of strife happening. It wasn't solely just the arrival of Perry. For one, there was mounting opposition against the shogunate. There was also famine that led to peasant uprisings. And the samurai class was also frustrated with the shogunate due to a loss in social status as well as economic issues. There were also people who wanted to open up Japan's borders to the Western world just completely. And there were also people who wanted to return governing authority over to the emperor. So there was a combination of issues, including the arrival of the US. And there were a lot of other issues that I didn't even mention. In the year 1867, two anti-Tokugawa clans would join forces to defeat the Tokugawa Shogunate and completely end its reign. They declared an imperial restoration, and a new period would come about known as the Meiji Restoration, named after the then 14-year-old emperor. Many reforms were introduced, like the end of the samurai class, a centralized government, a constitution was created with Western influence, and there was the adoption of Western cultures and technology, among many other things. This was a super fun topic to research. I hope that you guys enjoy this video. I really hope that I did this topic justice. I really wanted to try to convey its history in a summarized format, but as unbiased as possible. And I'm sure if I messed up anywhere, somebody is going to be more than happy to let me know in the comments. But rather than to stray away from more diverse histories, I'd rather attempt to do it some justice. So anyway, that's it for this video. Until next time.